My name is Dolores. I'm 65 years old. And right now, standing in the doorway of my modest living room, are the two men who taught me that family doesn't always mean loyalty. My ex-husband Leonard is sitting on my new couch like he paid for it. My son Calvin is leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, staring at me like I owe him the world. And between them, hanging in the air like poison, is a demand that makes my blood boil. $10,000. They want me to hand over $10,000 of my hard-earned retirement money. Just like that. As if I didn't bleed for every single cent. Leonard smiles that oily smile I used to mistake for charm. He says it so casually, like he's asking me to pass the salt. Dee, let's be reasonable. You don't need all that money anyway. Calvin needs a fresh start. We figured you'd want to help your own son. I stand there, coffee pot still warm in my hand, and I feel something rising in my chest. It's not anger. Not yet. It's something colder. Something sharper. It's the memory of 37 years spent scrubbing floors while this man slept with other women. It's the echo of every birthday I missed because I was working double shifts to keep the lights on. It's the weight of every lie Calvin ever told me while I handed him cash I didn't have to spare. Have you ever been asked to pay for your own disrespect? Have you ever had someone look you dead in the eye and demand that you fund the very laziness that broke your heart? Because that's exactly what's happening to me right now, and I'm about to do something I should have done decades ago. Calvin shifts his weight and speaks up, his voice dripping with entitlement. Mama, it's only fair. You've been sitting on all this money while I've been struggling. Pops told me about your pension and your Social Security. You're doing just fine. I need this more than you do. I set the coffee pot down slowly. My hands are steady, but inside, my heart is pounding. These two men walked into my home after years of silence, sat down in chairs they have no right to sit in, and decided that my peace was theirs to take. Leonard hasn't called me in over 10 years. Not once. Not for Christmas, not for my birthday, not even when I had surgery on my knee 3 years ago. Calvin? He's 30 years old and still acts like the world owes him something, just for waking up in the morning. Leonard leans forward, resting his elbows on his knees like we're having some kind of business meeting. Look, Dee, I don't want this to get ugly, but if you don't help Calvin, people are gonna talk. They're gonna say his own mama turned her back on him. You don't want that, do you? That word. Mama. He says it like it's supposed to melt me. Like it's supposed to make me forget that this grown man has never held a job longer than 6 months. Like it's supposed to erase the fact that I raised him alone while his father chased dreams that never came true. I take a breath. My voice comes out. Calm, but there's steel underneath. Let me ask you both something. When I was working 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads, where were you, Leonard? He doesn't answer. He just waves his hand like the question is irrelevant. I turn to Calvin. And when I paid for your college tuition twice, what did you do with it? Calvin looks away. That's not fair, Mama. I wasn't ready for school. You weren't ready, I repeat slowly. But you're ready to ask me for $10,000. Leonard stands up. He's tall, broad-shouldered, and he's trying to use his size to intimidate me. It worked when I was younger. It doesn't work anymore. Dee, don't make this harder than it has to be. We're family. Family helps each other. I almost laugh. Family. This man left me to raise our son alone. He showed up when it was convenient and disappeared when it wasn't. And now he's standing in my house talking about family like he knows what the word means. My hand trembles slightly as I walk toward the hallway. Leonard watches me with suspicion. Calvin straightens up, probably thinking I'm going to get my checkbook. But I'm not. I'm going to get something far more powerful than money. I'm going to get the truth. I reach into the hallway closet and pull out a manila envelope. It's thick, worn at the edges, and it's been sitting there for years. Inside are copies of every bank transfer I've ever made to Calvin, every tuition payment, every rent check when he couldn't keep a job, every car repair bill, every emergency loan that was never paid back. Thousands and thousands of dollars. Gone. Spent. Wasted. I walk back into the living room and drop the envelope on the coffee table. It lands with a heavy thud. "Open it," I say quietly. Leonard frowns. Calvin doesn't move, so I open it myself. I pull out the first stack of papers and spread them across the table like evidence in a courtroom. Bank statements, transfer receipts, canceled checks, all of them with Calvin's name on them. "This," I say, my voice rising just slightly, "is what I've already given. That's 12 years of sacrifice right there. 12 years of bailing you out, paying your bills, covering your mistakes. And you know what I got in return?" Calvin won't look at me. Leonard crosses his arms, his jaw tight. "Nothing," I say. "I got nothing. No thank you, no effort to change, no respect. Just more excuses and more demands." Leonard clears his throat. "We're not saying you didn't help. We're just saying it's time to help again." "Help again?" I repeat. My voice is sharper now. "You mean keep enabling? You mean keep pretending that throwing money at a grown man is going to make him responsible?" Calvin finally speaks, and there's an edge in his voice. "You're being selfish, Mama." That word hits me like a slap. Selfish. He called me selfish. The woman who gave up everything so he could have a chance at a better life just called me selfish because I won't hand over my retirement savings. Something inside me breaks. Not in a sad way, in a liberating way, like a chain snapping after holding too much weight for too long. I stand up straight. My shoulders pull back. My voice comes out calm, clear, and final. Let me tell you what selfish really looks like. Selfish is a man who abandons his wife and child, then shows up decades later asking for money. Selfish is a son who's never worked an honest day, but thinks his mother owes him a fortune. Selfish is both of you walking into my home and demanding that I give up the only peace I've ever earned. Leonard's face hardens. "You're gonna regret this, Dee." "No," I say quietly. "I'm not." I walk to the front door and open it wide. The afternoon sunlight pours in, bright and unforgiving. I turn back to look at them, these two men who took so much from me and gave back so little. And that's when I said the 5 words that changed everything forever. If you've ever been taken for granted by family, you need to hear what happens next. Hit that subscribe button because this story gets wild. I wasn't always this strong. There was a time when I believed that love meant swallowing your pride and keeping quiet when your heart was screaming. I learned that from my mother. She was a factory worker in Atlanta, spent 40 years on an assembly line putting together car parts. My father worked right beside her, same factory, same tired eyes at the end of every shift. They didn't have much, but they had dignity. And they had lessons they made sure I never forgot. My mother used to tell me, "Child, don't argue with fools. Life has a way of settling scores better than your mouth ever could." I was young then, maybe 14 or 15, and I didn't understand what she meant. I thought she was telling me to be weak, to let people walk all over me. But now, standing here at 65 with my hand on that open door, I finally understand. She wasn't teaching me weakness. She was teaching me patience. The kind of patience that waits for the right moment to strike back. I grew up in a small house on the south side of Atlanta. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen that always smelled like cornbread and collard greens. My parents worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when overtime was available. They taught me that hard work wasn't just about money. It was about self-respect. It was about being able to look yourself in the mirror and know you earned everything you had. I carried those lessons with me into adulthood. I got a job at a local diner when I was 18, saving every dollar I could. I wasn't dreaming of riches. I was dreaming of stability. A life where I didn't have to worry about the lights getting cut off or the rent being late. I wanted peace. That's all I ever wanted. Then I met Leonard. I was 26 years old, working the morning shift at that same diner when he walked in. He was tall, clean-shaven, and dressed in a suit that looked expensive. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee, black, no sugar. When I brought it to him, he smiled at me like I was the only woman in the room. Maybe I was. But in that moment, I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt before. He came back the next day. And the day after that. By the end of the week, he was asking me out. He told me he was a businessman, that he had big plans, that he was going to build something special. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He had confidence. He had charm. He had a way of talking that made you feel like everything was going to be okay. We got married 6 months later. Small ceremony, just a few friends and family. My mother pulled me aside before I walked down the aisle and asked me one question. "Baby, are you sure about this man?" I told her yes. I told her I loved him. She nodded, kissed my forehead, and said, "Then I pray he loves you back the same way." He didn't. The first year of marriage was fine. We lived in a little apartment near downtown. Leonard talked a lot about his business ideas. He had notebooks full of plans, sketches, numbers that were supposed to add up to something big, but nothing ever materialized. Months went by, and the only income coming into our home was mine. I was still working at the diner, picking up extra shifts to cover rent. I didn't complain. I thought that's what a good wife did. Support her husband. Believe in his dreams even when those dreams didn't pay the electric bill. Then one day, Leonard didn't come home. It was a Thursday night. I remember because Thursdays were my late shifts and I'd made his favorite dinner before I left for work. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. When I got home at midnight, the food was still on the stove, untouched. His car wasn't in the driveway. I waited up until 3 in the morning, calling his pager over and over. Nothing. He showed up Friday afternoon like nothing had happened. No apology. No explanation. Just a shrug and some vague story about staying with a friend to work on a business deal. I smelled perfume on his shirt. It wasn't mine. I didn't say anything. I swallowed the hurt, the anger, the betrayal. I told myself it was a one-time thing, that he'd made a mistake, that he'd do better. He didn't. Over the next few years, Leonard's disappearances became a pattern. He'd vanish for a day, sometimes 2, then come back with stories that didn't quite add up. Bills piled up on the kitchen table. The phone company called asking when we'd pay. The landlord knocked on the door with eviction notices, and every single time, Leonard had an excuse. The deal fell through. The investor backed out. The timing wasn't right. I worked harder. I picked up a second job cleaning office buildings at night. I barely slept. I barely ate. But I kept us afloat. I told myself it was temporary, that one day Leonard would come through, that one day things would get better. Then I got pregnant. I found out on a Tuesday morning. I was 29 years old, exhausted and terrified. I didn't know how we were going to afford a baby when we could barely afford groceries. But when I told Leonard, he smiled. He kissed my forehead and said, "This is it, Dee. This is our fresh start. I'm going to be a father. I'm going to step up." I wanted to believe him. I held on to those words like a lifeline. And when our son, Calvin, was born, I looked down at that tiny, perfect face and made a promise. I promised him a better life. I promised him I'd give him everything I never had. I promised him I'd sacrifice whatever it took to make sure he had opportunities. But the real test of my patience didn't come from Leonard. It came the day I held my newborn son in my arms and made a promise I would later regret. Drop a comment if you've ever ignored red flags for love. Let's talk about it. Calvin weighed 7 pounds, 3 ounces when he came into this world. I remember holding him in that hospital room, feeling his tiny heartbeat against my chest, and thinking that everything was going to change. I thought Leonard would finally grow up. I thought becoming a father would flip some switch inside him and turn him into the man I needed him to be. But hope doesn't pay bills, and wishes don't raise children. I went back to work 3 weeks after giving birth. I had no choice. Leonard's latest business venture had collapsed before it even started, and we were 2 months behind on rent. I got my old job back at the diner, working the breakfast and lunch shifts. Then I picked up a night job as a cashier at the grocery store on 5th Street. I'd work from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, come home to feed and change Calvin, then head back out at 6 in the evening and work until midnight. I barely slept. Most nights, I'd get home around 1 in the morning, check on Calvin, and collapse into bed for 4 hours before starting all over again. My body ached constantly. My hands were raw from washing dishes and scanning groceries, but every time I looked at my baby boy sleeping peacefully in his crib, I told myself it was worth it. Leonard came and went like the wind. Some weeks he'd be home every night, playing with Calvin, talking about his next big idea. Other weeks I wouldn't see him for days. He'd come back smelling like cigarettes and cheap cologne, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes avoiding mine. I stopped asking where he'd been. The lies were more insulting than the truth. When Calvin was 2, I found lipstick on Leonard's collar. Red. Bright. Bold. Unmistakable. I held that shirt in my hands and felt something inside me crack. Not break. Just crack. Like a piece of glass that's been hit but hasn't shattered yet. I washed the shirt, hung it up, and never said a word. I poured everything into Calvin. I missed his first steps because I was mopping floors at an office building downtown. I missed his first words because I was stocking shelves at the grocery store. But I was there for the things that mattered. I made sure he had clean clothes, hot meals, and a mother who loved him more than anything in this world. By the time Calvin turned 5, he was a sweet kid. Curious, polite, always eager to help, he'd wait for me by the window when I came home from work. His little face pressed against the glass, smiling when he saw me pull up. Those moments made everything worth it. Every sore muscle, every sleepless night, every tear I cried in the grocery store bathroom during my break. It was all for him. But Leonard was poisoning him slowly, like drops of venom in a glass of milk. I'd come home and hear Leonard telling Calvin things that made my stomach turn. "Son, you don't need to work yourself to death like your mama. A smart man knows how to work the system. A smart man knows how to talk his way into money." Calvin would sit there, wide-eyed, soaking it all in like gospel, and I couldn't say anything, because Leonard would accuse me of undermining him, of trying to turn our son against him. When Calvin turned 8, we planned a birthday party. Nothing big, just a small gathering with a few kids from his class, some cake, and presents I'd saved up for months to buy. I took the day off work, decorated the apartment with streamers and balloons, baked a chocolate cake from scratch. Calvin was so excited he could barely sit still. Leonard promised he'd be there. He looked Calvin in the eye that morning and said, "Daddy wouldn't miss your birthday for anything, champ." But 6 o'clock came and went. The kids arrived, played games, sang happy birthday. Calvin kept looking at the door, waiting for his father to walk through. 7 o'clock. 8 o'clock. The other parents started picking up their children. Calvin's smile faded with each passing hour. By 9 o'clock it was just me and Calvin sitting on the couch, half a cake still on the table, presents unopened. He looked up at me with those big brown eyes and asked, "Did Daddy forget about me?" I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. Leonard showed up 3 days later. No apology. No explanation. Just a cheap toy he probably picked up at a gas station. Calvin's face lit up when he saw it, and that hurt even more than Leonard's absence. My son was learning to accept crumbs and call them love. As Calvin grew older, I watched him change. He was still a good kid in a lot of ways, respectful to teachers, kind to other children, but something was shifting. He started making excuses for not doing his homework. He'd tell me stories that didn't quite add up. He'd ask for money and get defensive when I asked what it was for. Little things at first. Small lies that I told myself were normal for a growing boy. But they weren't normal. They were Leonard's influence taking root. When Calvin turned 16, he got his first job bagging groceries at the same store where I'd worked nights for years. He lasted 2 weeks before quitting, said the manager was disrespectful, said the work was beneath him. Leonard backed him up, told him he was right to walk away, that a man shouldn't let anyone talk down to him. I tried to explain that every job has difficult moments, that respect is earned through consistency and hard work. But Calvin just shrugged and said, "Pops says I don't need to break my back for minimum wage." Leonard had poisoned the well, and I was too tired to keep fighting. By the time Calvin turned 18, Leonard had all but abandoned us. He'd moved in with another woman across town, someone younger with no kids and no expectations. He'd call Calvin occasionally, fill his head with more nonsense about shortcuts and easy money, then disappear again for months. I enrolled Calvin in community college, paid his tuition with money I'd been saving for years. He went for 1 semester, then dropped out, said the classes were boring, said he'd figure out his own path. I tried to be supportive. I tried to give him space to find himself, but deep down, I knew what was happening. He was becoming his father. He enrolled again a year later. I paid the tuition again. He dropped out again. Same excuses. Same lack of accountability, same expectation that I'd just keep funding his aimless drifting. When Calvin turned 21, he was still living at home, still unemployed, still full of big talk and empty promises. He'd sleep until noon, play video games until dinner, then ask me for money like it was my job to subsidize his laziness. And every time I looked at him, I saw Leonard. The same charm, the same excuses, the same belief that the world owed him something just for existing. By the time Calvin turned 21, I realized I hadn't raised a man. I'd raised a reflection of his father, and it was too late to undo the damage. If you're loving this story, smash that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message. I stopped believing in miracles around the time Calvin dropped out of college for the second time. He was 23 years old, sitting on my couch eating cereal at 2 p.m, telling me that higher education was a scam and that he'd learn more from life experience. Leonard called that same evening, not to check on me, but to tell me I was being too hard on the boy. He said Calvin just needed time to find himself, that not everyone was meant to follow the traditional path. I listened to him talk, phone pressed against my ear, and I felt something die inside me. Not love. I'd stopped loving Leonard years ago. What died was hope. The hope that either of them would ever change. That's when I started saving in secret. It wasn't a grand plan at first. I didn't sit down and calculate how much I'd need to escape or retire, or finally live in peace. It started small. $20 here, $50 there. Money I'd pull from my paycheck before I even brought it home. I'd cash my check at the bank, take out a little extra, and tuck it away before Calvin could see how much I'd actually earned. I opened an account at a credit union across town, far from the neighborhood where Leonard or Calvin might accidentally stumble across it. No statements mailed to the house. No debit card sitting in my wallet. Just a small passbook I kept hidden in the lining of an old winter coat in the back of my closet. Every 2 weeks I'd make a deposit. Sometimes it was only $30. Sometimes if I picked up an extra shift or got a holiday bonus, it was $100. I never touched it. Never even thought about touching it. That account wasn't for emergencies. It was for survival. It was for the day when I'd finally had enough and needed a way out. I'd left the diner years earlier and taken a job at a nursing home on the east side of town. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady. I worked in housekeeping and laundry services, washing bedsheets and cleaning rooms for elderly folks who could no longer do it themselves. It was hard work, physically draining. But there was a dignity in it that I hadn't felt in years. These people needed me. They appreciated me. They said thank you when I brought them fresh towels or helped them rearrange their furniture. It was a small thing, but it mattered. The younger nurses complained constantly about the pay. They'd sit in the break room during lunch, scrolling through their phones, talking about how they deserved more money, better benefits, longer vacations. I'd sit quietly in the corner, eating my packed lunch, and say nothing. I didn't disagree with them. They probably did deserve more, but complaining wouldn't change anything. Action would. So while they talked, I saved. One afternoon, I came home from work and found Calvin sitting at the kitchen table, rifling through a stack of mail. My heart stopped. I kept most of my important documents hidden, but every now and then, something would slip through. I walked over casually, trying to keep my voice steady, and asked what he was looking for. He didn't even look up. Just checking to see if you got anything important. You never tell me what's going on with the bills. I gently took the mail from his hands, scanning the envelopes quickly. Nothing from the credit union. Nothing that would give away my secret. I exhaled slowly and told him everything was fine, that I had it under control. He shrugged and went back to his phone, completely unaware of how close he'd come to discovering the one thing I was protecting more fiercely than anything else in my life. That night, I moved my passbook. I took it out of the coat lining and hid it inside an old Bible on my nightstand. Leonard had never opened a Bible in his life, and Calvin wouldn't know where to start. It was the safest place I could think of. Years passed. I kept working, kept saving, kept my mouth shut when Calvin asked for money. And he asked often. Gas money. Grocery money. Money for job applications that never turned into jobs. Money for clothes he didn't need, and electronics he'd pawn a month later. Every time he asked, I'd give him just enough to get by, but never so much that he'd stop asking. Because as long as he was asking me, he wasn't looking for my real money. The money I was hiding, the money that was going to set me free. When Calvin turned 30, Leonard finally left for good. He'd been in and out of our lives for years, but this time felt different. He called me one evening and told me he was done. Done pretending we were a family. Done pretending he cared. He said he'd met someone new, someone who appreciated him, someone who didn't nag him about responsibility. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I just said okay and hung up the phone. I thought I'd feel sad. I thought there'd be some lingering attachment, some sense of loss. But all I felt was relief. Leonard was finally, completely, permanently gone. The weight I'd been carrying for decades lifted just a little bit. I could breathe easier. I could move through my house without the constant tension of wondering when he'd show up, what he'd want, what lie he'd tell next. But Calvin stayed. And somehow, that was worse. Without Leonard around, Calvin had no one else to turn to, no one else to mooch off of, no one else to validate his excuses. So he doubled down on me. He treated me like an ATM with an endless supply of cash. He'd ask for $20 for gas, then come back 2 hours later, asking for 50 more because he needed to fix his car. He'd say he had a job interview and needed money for new shoes, then never mention the interview again. He'd promise to pay me back, swear on his life that this time would be different, and then forget the promise the moment the cash was in his hand. I watched my son become a professional beggar, and it broke my heart in ways Leonard never could. Because Leonard was never really mine. But Calvin was supposed to be different. Calvin was supposed to be better. Calvin was supposed to be the reason all my suffering meant something. Instead, he became my greatest disappointment. I kept saving. Every paycheck, every overtime shift, every small windfall went straight into that hidden account. I didn't let Calvin's failure stop me. I didn't let his guilt trips derail my plan, because I knew, deep in my bones, that one day I'd need that money. One day, I'd finally say no. And when that day came, I wanted to have something to fall back on, something they couldn't take from me. For the next 15 years, I became my son's ATM, and every withdrawal broke my heart a little more. But I kept one secret that would soon become my salvation. Comment Peace Fund if you believe in saving for yourself. Let me know you're still here. 37 years. That's how long I worked at Meadowbrook Nursing Home. 37 years of washing sheets stained with things I won't describe. 37 years of mopping floors, scrubbing bathrooms, and folding towels until my fingers ached. 37 years of watching residents come and go, some peacefully, some not. I'd seen people take their last breaths in rooms I'd just cleaned an hour before. I'd held hands with women who had no family left to visit them. I'd listened to stories from men who'd fought in wars I only read about in history books. That job wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And when my retirement day finally came, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Pride. My supervisor threw me a small party in the break room. There was sheet cake from the grocery store, a card signed by the staff, and a plaque with my name engraved on it. The director gave a speech about dedication and service, and the younger nurses clapped politely. I stood there in my uniform for the last time, looked around at the faces of people I'd worked alongside for years, and felt tears sting my eyes. Not because I was sad to leave, but because I'd finally made it. I'd survived. My pension kicked in 2 weeks later. It wasn't a fortune, but it was steady. Social Security started coming in right after that, and then, like a gift from above, I received a letter from a lawyer in Alabama. My cousin Ernestine had passed away, and she'd left me a small inheritance. $15,000. I sat in my kitchen holding that letter, reading it over and over, unable to believe it was real. Ernestine and I hadn't been close in years, but she'd remembered me. She'd thought of me, and she'd given me something no one else ever had. A cushion, a buffer, a chance to finally breathe. For the first time in my entire life, I wasn't struggling. I wasn't scraping by, praying the car wouldn't break down or the water heater wouldn't go out. I had enough. More than enough. I could pay my bills on time, buy groceries without checking my account balance first, and still have money left over. It felt like a dream. A beautiful, impossible dream. I started buying things I'd denied myself for decades. Small things, mostly. I replaced the old couch that sagged in the middle with a new one, soft gray fabric, firm cushions that didn't hurt my back. I bought myself a delicate silver bracelet from a jewelry store downtown, something I'd wanted since I was a young woman, but never had the money for. And then, the crown jewel of my purchases, I bought a recliner. A beautiful, plush, burgundy recliner that sat in the corner of my living room like a throne. I'd sit in it every evening after dinner, remote in hand, feet up, and feel something I'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. But peace doesn't go unnoticed in a house where entitlement lives. Calvin started asking questions almost immediately. He'd come home from wherever he'd been and look around the living room with narrowed eyes. "Where'd you get this couch, Mama?" he'd ask. I'd tell him I bought it. He'd nod slowly, like he was calculating something in his head. "Must have been expensive," he'd say. I'd shrug and change the subject. But I could feel his wheels turning. I could see him wondering where the money came from. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store and found Calvin standing in the kitchen, holding a piece of my mail. My stomach dropped. It was a bank statement. Not from my secret account, thank God, but from my regular checking account. the one where my pension and Social Security were deposited. He looked up at me with a strange expression on his face. Not quite anger, not quite jealousy. Something in between. "Mama," he said slowly, "you've been holding out on me." I set the grocery bags down on the counter and walked over calmly, taking the statement from his hands. "That's my personal business, Calvin." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Personal business? I'm your son. I live here. Don't I have a right to know what's going on?" "You have a right," I said quietly, "to get a job and pay your own bills. What I do with my money is none of your concern." His jaw tightened. He didn't say anything else, but I could see the resentment building behind his eyes. He walked out of the kitchen, and I heard his bedroom door slam a few minutes later. I stood there alone, heart pounding, knowing that this was just the beginning. Calvin had smelled blood in the water, and he wasn't going to let it go. Over the next few weeks, his questions became more direct. How much was my pension? How much Social Security was I getting? What happened to Cousin Ernestine's money? Did I invest it? Was I saving it? Every time he asked, I deflected. I told him I was managing just fine, that he didn't need to worry about my finances. But the more I deflected, the more persistent he became. He started dropping hints, little comments designed to make me feel guilty. "Must be nice to finally relax while I'm out here struggling," he'd say. Or, "I guess after all these years, you deserve to treat yourself, even if it means I'm still stuck." I ignored him. I'd spent decades letting guilt control my decisions, and I wasn't going to let it control me anymore. But Calvin wasn't working alone. I didn't know it yet, but behind my back, he was making phone calls, reaching out to someone I thought I'd never hear from again. Then one afternoon, my phone rang. The name on the screen made my blood run cold. Leonard. After 10 years of silence, he wanted to talk, and I knew exactly why. If you've ever felt the weight of family expecting you to fund their laziness, drop an emoji. You're not alone. I stared at Leonard's name on my phone screen for 3 rings before I answered. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, to delete it without listening, to pretend he didn't exist. But curiosity got the better of me. After 10 years of complete silence, what could this man possibly want from me now? I pressed the green button and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello?" His voice came through smooth as honey, that same oily confidence I remembered from our early days. "Dee, it's been a long time." I didn't respond. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. He cleared his throat and continued. "I heard you finally retired. That's good. Real good. You always were the hard-working one. 37 years at that nursing home, right? That's something to be proud of." My grip tightened on the phone. How did he know how long I'd worked there? How did he know I'd retired at all? I hadn't spoken to Leonard in a decade. We had no mutual friends. No reason to cross paths, which meant only one person could have told him. Calvin. "What do you want, Leonard?" I asked, my voice flat. He chuckled like we were old friends catching up over coffee. "Can't a man call to congratulate his ex-wife on her retirement? I always respected your work ethic, Dee. You know that." "You respected it enough to let me work 2 jobs while you chased pipe dreams," I said coldly. "So I'll ask again. What do you want?" There was a pause. Then his tone shifted. Just slightly. The warmth drained out, replaced by something more calculating. "Listen, me and Calvin been talking. He told me you've been doing real well for yourself. Pension coming in, Social Security, maybe a little something extra on the side. That's beautiful, Dee. You deserve it after all those years." I closed my eyes. There it was. The setup. The manipulation. The reason for this call. Leonard kept talking. Now, I don't want to see my son struggling while his mama's sitting comfortable. That wouldn't be right. We thought it'd be fair if you helped him out a little. Nothing crazy, just enough to get him on his feet. Maybe a few thousand. You don't need all that money anyway. You're retired. You got everything you need. My heart pounded in my chest, but my voice stayed calm. A few $1,000s. Yeah, Leonard said, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Calvin's got some ideas, some real good ideas. He just needs a little capital to get started. I told him I'd help him manage it, make sure he uses it right. It's an investment in your son's future, Dee. I almost laughed. An investment. Leonard was calling it an investment. The man who'd never invested a dime in anything except his own selfishness was now asking me to fund my son's latest fantasy. And what makes you think I have a few $1,000s to give? I asked. Come on, Dee, he said, his voice turning slightly impatient. Don't play dumb. The boy told me everything. You've been living nice. New furniture, new jewelry. You're not hurting for money. All we're asking is that you share a little bit with family. Before I could respond, I heard shuffling on the other end of the line. Muffled voices. Then a new voice came through, one that made my stomach turn. Calvin. Mama, he said, and I could hear the rehearsed tone in his voice, like he'd practiced this speech with Leonard beforehand. You can at least help me start a business. I've been thinking about it for months. I've got a solid plan. Pop said he'd help me manage the money, make sure I don't waste it. This could really change my life. I sat down slowly on my new couch, the phone pressed so hard against my ear it hurt. My son. My only child. The boy I'd sacrificed everything for. He was standing with his father, the man who'd abandoned us, and together they were scheming to take my retirement money. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, sharp and sudden, stealing the breath from my lungs. Calvin, I said quietly, you called your father. The man who left us. The man who didn't pay a single bill or show up to a single birthday for the last 10 years. You called him and told him about my money. There was a pause. Then Calvin's voice came back, defensive. I needed advice, Mama. Pops understands business better than you do. Something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet, final break. Like a rope that's been fraying for years and finally gives way. If you both want to talk, I said, my voice eerily calm, come to my house tomorrow. We'll discuss it face to face. Leonard's voice came back on the line, smug and satisfied. Now that's what I like to hear. Reasonable. Mature. We'll be there around 2. ND? Don't make this harder than it has to be. We're family. I didn't respond. I just hung up. I sat there in my living room, phone still in my hand, staring at the recliner I'd bought with money I'd earned through blood, sweat, and tears. I thought about all the years I'd spent biting my tongue, all the times I'd swallowed my anger to keep the peace, all the moments I'd let these 2 men walk all over me because I thought that's what love required. But I was done. Done being silent. Done being used. Done letting them treat me like a bank account with no feelings and no rights. I stood up and walked to my bedroom. I opened my closet and pulled out the old Bible on my nightstand. Inside was my passbook, the one that showed every deposit I'd made over the years. Thousands of dollars I'd hidden away, protected, saved for this exact moment. Then I walked to my desk and pulled out another folder. This one was thicker. Inside were copies of every bank transfer I'd ever made to Calvin, every tuition payment, every rent check, every emergency loan, thousands and thousands of dollars, all documented, all proof of what I'd already given. I placed both items on my kitchen table and stared at them. Evidence, truth, power. Tomorrow, Leonard and Calvin were coming to my house expecting me to roll over and hand them my piece, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. They still saw me as the quiet, subservient woman who'd spent decades taking their abuse without fighting back. They thought I was weak. They thought I was broken. I hung up the phone and sat in silence. They thought they were walking into an easy payday, but I had been preparing for this moment my entire life. Tomorrow, they would learn who Dolores really was. Subscribe if you want to see entitled family members get exactly what they deserve. I woke up that morning with a strange sense of calm. I made my bed, smoothed the covers carefully, and got dressed in a simple navy blue blouse and black slacks. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would make me look like I was trying too hard. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a woman who'd worked her entire life and earned every single thing she owned. I brewed a pot of coffee around 1:30. The smell filled my small kitchen, rich and bitter, the way I liked it. I set out 3 mugs on the counter, though I had no intention of offering them anything. It just felt right. Proper. Like I was handling a business meeting instead of a shakedown. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard a car pull into my driveway. I looked out the window and saw Leonard stepping out of a late model sedan that was probably borrowed or rented. He was wearing slacks and a button-down shirt, like he was coming to negotiate a real estate deal. Calvin climbed out of the passenger side, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes scanning my house like he was appraising it. I opened the door before they could knock. Leonard smiled that same slick smile I remembered, the one that used to make my heart flutter and now just made my skin crawl. "Dee," he said warmly, like we were old friends. "You look good. Retirement suits you." I stepped aside without a word and let them in. Leonard walked past me, his eyes immediately sweeping across my living room. He took in the new couch, the recliner, the small decorations I'd added to make the space feel like mine. "Well, well," he said, nodding slowly. "You've been living good, Dee. Real cozy in here." Calvin followed behind him, barely making eye contact with me. He sat down on the couch without being invited, like he still lived here, like this was still his space to claim. Leonard took the armchair across from him, settling in like he was about to conduct a board meeting. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, arms crossed, watching them. Neither of them asked how I was doing. Neither of them acknowledged that this was the first time we'd all been in the same room in over a decade. They were here for one thing, and they weren't going to waste time pretending otherwise. Leonard leaned back in the chair, fingers laced together over his stomach. "Let's make this simple, Dee. No need to drag it out. You give Calvin $10,000. That'll be enough to help him get on his feet, start that business he's been talking about. I'll make sure he uses it right. You've still got plenty to live on. Everybody wins." $10,000. He said it so casually, like he was asking me to lend him a 20 for gas. My hand, resting on the back of the couch, tightened into a fist. Calvin nodded along, finally looking up at me. "It's only fair, Mama. You've been sitting on all this money while I've been struggling. I'm your son. You're supposed to help me." I stared at him for a long moment. This man, 30 years old, sitting on my couch, demanding money like I owed him a debt I'd never agreed to pay. I thought about all the nights I'd worked while he slept, all the checks I'd written while he played video games, all the sacrifices I'd made while he coasted through life expecting everything to be handed to him. My voice, when I finally spoke, was low, controlled, but there was steel underneath. "Struggling," I repeated slowly. "You've been struggling." Calvin shifted uncomfortably. Leonard's smile didn't waver. I took a step closer. "Calvin, you've had every chance a man could ask for. You had a roof over your head. You had food on the table. You had a mother who worked herself to the bone to make sure you never went without. I paid for your college. Twice. I paid your rent when you couldn't keep a job. I gave you money every time you asked. No questions, no conditions. And what did you do with it?" Calvin's jaw tightened. "Here we go," he muttered, always throwing the past in my face. "The past?" I said, my voice rising just slightly. "Calvin, the past is the only thing we have to judge the future by, and your past tells me that every dollar I've ever given you disappeared into nothing. No progress, no growth, just more excuses." He rolled his eyes. "You're always judging me, Mama. Always making me feel like I'm not good enough." That stung. Not because it was true, but because he genuinely believed it. He genuinely thought that holding him accountable was the same as not loving him. Leonard cleared his throat, sensing the tension rising. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more authoritative tone. "Dee, let's not turn this into something emotional. This is simple. You have money. Calvin needs money. You help him and everybody moves on. If you don't, well..." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "People are going to talk. They're going to say his own mama turned her back on him when he needed her most. They're going to say you're sitting on a pile of cash while your son's out here struggling. You really want that kind of reputation?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. This man who'd contributed nothing to our family, who'd walked away when things got hard, who'd reappeared only when there was something to gain. And he had the nerve to threaten me, to tell me what people would think, to weaponize my reputation against me. My hand tightened around the coffee mug I'd picked up from the counter. The ceramic was warm against my palm, grounding me, reminding me that this was real. This was actually happening. Leonard continued, his voice dripping with false concern. "Come on, Dee, don't make this difficult. We're family. Family looks out for each other." "Family," I repeated softly. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. Calvin leaned forward, his voice taking on that whiny, manipulative tone I'd heard 1,000 times before. "Mama, please, I just need this one thing. After this, I won't ask you for anything else, I promise." I'd heard that promise before, so many times, and every single time it had been a lie. Leonard stood up, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "Dee, we didn't come here to argue. We came here to work something out. Now, are you going to help your son or not?" I set the coffee mug down on the table carefully. My hands were steady. My voice was steady. But inside, a fire was burning. A fire that had been smoldering for decades, fed by every insult, every betrayal, every moment of disrespect I'd endured from these two men. "You want to know if I'm going to help my son?" I said quietly. "Let me tell you what help looks like. Help is working 2 jobs so your child has food and shelter. Help is sacrificing your own dreams so your child can have opportunities. Help is showing up every single day, even when you're exhausted and heartbroken and ready to give up. I've been helping Calvin his entire life. What you're asking for isn't help, it's enabling." Leonard's expression hardened. "So that's your answer. You're going to be selfish." That word, selfish. It hit me like a slap across the face. This man, who'd taken everything and given nothing, was calling me selfish. My son, who'd lived off my labor for 30 years, was nodding in agreement. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I stood up, and I said, "Comment, stand your ground if you're Team Dolores." I stood up slowly, my body unfolding like a blade being drawn from its sheath. My voice, when it came out, was calm. Dangerously calm. The kind of calm that comes right before a storm. "Let me tell you both something," I said, looking from Leonard to Calvin and back again. "Every single dollar in this house came from these hands." I held up my hands, palms facing them, hands that were scarred from years of labor, wrinkled from age, but still strong, still capable. Not from luck, not from handouts, not from charm or smooth talk or empty promises, from work. Real, honest, backbreaking work. Leonard leaned back in his chair and smirked. That same condescending smirk I'd seen 1,000 times before. "We're not saying you didn't work, Dee. We're saying it's time to share. That's what family does." "Share?" I repeated, my voice dropping even lower. "You mean surrender. You mean hand over the only reward I've ever received for being responsible when neither of you lifted a finger to help me." Calvin shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "Mama, you're being dramatic." "Dramatic," I said, almost laughing. "You think this is dramatic? Let me show you something." I turned and walked toward the hallway. I could feel their eyes on my back, watching, wondering what I was doing. Leonard probably thought I was going to get my checkbook. Calvin probably thought I'd finally caved, that I was going to come back and hand them what they wanted. They had no idea what was coming. I reached into the hall closet and pulled out the thick manila envelope I'd prepared the night before. It was heavy in my hands, weighted with years of proof, years of receipts, years of evidence that I'd already given more than any mother should ever have to give. I walked back into the living room and stood in front of the coffee table, looking down at both of them. "You want to talk about what I owe you?" I said quietly. "Let's talk about it." I dropped the envelope onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud that echoed in the silence. Neither of them moved. I reached down, opened it, and pulled out the first stack of papers. Bank statements, transfer receipts, copies of checks I'd written over the years, all made out to Calvin. I spread them across the table like evidence in a courtroom. Dates, amounts, purposes. Tuition for the first semester of community college, $1,500. Tuition for the second attempt, another $1,500. Rent payment when he couldn't hold down a job, $800. Car repair because he crashed into a mailbox while texting, $1,200. Emergency loan because he needed to get back on his feet, $2,000, and on and on and on. "This," I said, my voice rising with each word, "is what I've already given. 12 years of sacrifice, right here in black and white. 12 years of bailing you out, covering your mistakes, funding your laziness. And you know what I got in return?" Calvin stared at the papers, his face pale. Leonard's smirk had faded. "Nothing," I said, my voice cracking just slightly. "I got nothing. No thank you. No accountability. No effort to change. Just more excuses and more demands." Leonard cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look, Dee, we appreciate what you've done in the past. But that was then. This is now. Calvin needs help now." "Help," I said, shaking my head. "You keep using that word like it means something different to you than it does to the rest of the world. What you're asking for isn't help. It's surrender. You want me to hand over my peace, my security, my retirement, so that Calvin can continue to avoid responsibility." Calvin finally spoke, his voice defensive and thin. "You don't understand what it's like out there, Mama. It's hard. Jobs don't pay enough. Everything's expensive. I'm trying." "Trying," I repeated. "Calvin, trying means showing up. Trying means working a job you don't like because it pays the bills. Trying means sacrificing comfort for progress. You've never tried. You've coasted. And every time you hit a bump, you came running to me expecting me to smooth it out." Leonard stood up, his voice hardening. "So that's it, then. You're just going to turn your back on your own son." "No," I said firmly. "I'm going to stop enabling him. There's a difference." Leonard took a step toward me, his voice low and threatening. "You're going to regret this, Dee. When word gets out that you refuse to help your own child, people are going to see you for what you really are, selfish, cold, a woman who cares more about money than her own blood." I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time in my life I didn't flinch. I didn't back down. I didn't let his words burrow into my heart and make me doubt myself. "Go ahead," I said calmly. "Tell them. Tell everyone you know that you showed up at my door after 10 years of silence to demand money from the woman you abandoned. Tell them that your 30-year-old son begged his mother for cash because he's too proud to stock shelves or drive a truck or do any of the honest work that millions of people do every single day. See how proud that makes you. The room went silent. Completely, utterly silent. Leonard's mouth opened, then closed. Calvin looked down at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. For the first time in decades, these two men who'd spent years talking over me, dismissing me, using me, had absolutely nothing to say. I walked past them to the front door. My hand rested on the knob, and I turned back to look at them one last time. They were still sitting there, frozen, like they couldn't quite believe what was happening. "Here's what I owe you now," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Nothing. Not $1. Not an apology. Not an explanation. I've given you everything I had to give, and it was never enough. So I'm done. I'm done being your safety net. I'm done being your ATM. I'm done letting you treat my love like a transaction." Leonard stood up, his face red with anger. "You'll regret this, Dee. Mark my words." I pulled the door open. Sunlight poured into the room, bright and warm and honest. "The only thing I regret," I said quietly, "is not doing this sooner." The room went silent. For the first time in decades, these two men had nothing to say. I walked to the door, opened it wide, and said the words I should have said 30 years ago. Hit like if you're living for this energy. Share this with someone who needs to learn boundaries. Now get out of my house. The words came out clear and final. No yelling, no drama. Just a simple command, backed by decades of suppressed dignity, finally breaking free. Leonard stood there for a moment, his face cycling through emotions. Shock, anger, disbelief. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, probably another threat or manipulation, but I raised my hand to stop him. I said, "Get out." Calvin stood up slowly, his eyes darting between me and his father like he was waiting for someone to fix this, to make it all go back to normal. But normal was over. Normal had been buried the moment they walked through my door with their hands out and their hearts empty. Leonard adjusted his collar, trying to salvage some dignity. "You're making a mistake, Dee. A big one." I didn't respond. I just stood there, holding the door open, my face expressionless, my resolve unshakable. After a long, tense moment, Leonard walked toward the door. He paused as he passed me, close enough that I could smell his cheap cologne, and whispered, "You'll come crawling back." "Keep waiting," I said softly. Calvin followed behind him, shoulders hunched, avoiding my gaze. He stopped at the threshold, turned back like he wanted to say something, but the words died on his lips. I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not remorse. Not yet. Just confusion. Like he genuinely couldn't understand why his mother had finally said no. I watched them walk to the car, watched Leonard slam his door, watched Calvin climb into the passenger seat and stare straight ahead. I watched them drive away, and when their car disappeared around the corner, I closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it for a long moment. Then I exhaled. Long and slow, like I'd been holding my breath for 30 years, and finally remembered how to breathe. 1 year passed. I didn't hear from Leonard, not a single call, text, or message. It was like he'd evaporated back into whatever life he'd been living before he decided I was worth exploiting. And honestly, I didn't care. His absence was a gift. Every day that passed without his voice in my ear was another day of peace I'd earned, Calvin called occasionally. Always from different numbers, probably because I'd blocked the previous ones. The first few times I answered out of habit, out of that deep maternal instinct that still hoped he might apologize, might have learned something. But he didn't. He argued. He accused. He told me I'd embarrassed him, that I'd ruined his chances, that I was a bitter old woman who didn't understand how hard life was. I stopped answering after that. I let his calls go to voicemail and deleted the messages without listening. I blocked the new numbers as they came in, and slowly the calls became less frequent, once a week, once a month, then nothing. Silence became my companion, and it was the most honest relationship I'd had in years. I fell into a routine. I'd wake up at a reasonable hour, not because an alarm forced me to, but because I wanted to. I'd make breakfast, usually something simple like oatmeal or toast and eggs. I'd read the newspaper in my recliner, feet up, coffee in hand. I'd go to the grocery store in the middle of the day when it wasn't crowded. I'd attend church on Sundays and volunteer at the community center on Wednesdays. I'd call my sister in Alabama and talk for hours about nothing important and everything meaningful. I wasn't rich. I wasn't living lavishly. But I was peaceful. And peace, I learned, was worth more than any amount of money I could have given away. One afternoon, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson stopped me while I was checking the mail. She was a sweet woman in her 70s, always knew everyone's business, but never in a malicious way. She smiled as she approached, holding a small, potted plant. "Dolores, I wanted to give you this. Just a little thank you for helping me with my groceries last week." I took the plant, touched by the gesture. "You didn't have to do that, but thank you." She nodded, then hesitated, like she was debating whether to say something. Finally, she leaned in slightly. "I saw your son the other day. Calvin. He was leaving the warehouse over on Market Street. Looked like he was finishing a shift." My heart stopped for just a second. "Calvin's working?" She nodded. "Yeah. I didn't want to say anything if you already knew, but I thought you'd want to hear it. He looked different. Tired, but in a good way, you know. Like he'd actually done something with his day." I thanked her and walked back into my house, the plant still in my hands. I set it on the kitchen counter and stood there processing what she'd said. Calvin was working. Actually working. For the first time in his adult life, he was earning his own paycheck, supporting himself, facing reality. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel smug. I felt something quieter. Relief, maybe. Or hope. The kind of hope that doesn't expect anything but welcomes change if it comes. That night, I sat in my recliner with the TV off. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. I thought about quiet justice, about how revenge doesn't always look like fire and fury. Sometimes it looks like a closed door. Sometimes it looks like a blocked number. Sometimes it looks like choosing yourself when everyone else expects you to keep sacrificing. I'd spent my whole life being loud in my work and silent in my pain. But silence, I realized, wasn't always weakness. Sometimes it was strategy. Sometimes it was strength. Sometimes it was the only thing that forced people to face themselves without you there to cushion their fall. Leonard had disappeared into obscurity. Calvin was learning slowly what it meant to stand on his own. And me? I was finally, truly, completely free. Then last month, on a Tuesday afternoon, someone knocked on my door. I opened it. And there stood Calvin. But this time, everything was different. Calvin stood on my doorstep looking like a different man. He was thinner, his face leaner, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of early mornings and honest exhaustion. His clothes were simple: work pants, a plain t-shirt, steel-toed boots that were scuffed and worn. He wasn't the same entitled, lazy man who'd sat on my couch a year ago demanding money. This person in front of me looked like someone who'd finally met himself and didn't like what he found. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, hands at his sides, eyes searching my face like he was trying to find permission to say what he'd come to say. Finally, his voice came out, quiet and strained. "Mama, I'm sorry." Those 3 words hung in the air between us. I didn't respond immediately. I'd waited 30 years to hear an apology, and now that it was here, I needed to know if it was real, if it came from his heart, or just from his circumstances. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Please, I won't stay long. I just need to talk to you." I studied him for another moment, then stepped aside. He walked in slowly, like he was entering a place he no longer had the right to claim. He didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of the living room, the same spot where he'd demanded $10,000, and his eyes swept across the space, like he was seeing it for the first time. "It looks nice in here," he said quietly. "Peaceful." I closed the door and crossed my arms. "What do you want, Calvin?" He took a breath, his shoulders rising and falling heavily. "I've been working at a warehouse over on Market Street. Loading trucks, moving inventory, it's hard work. My back hurts every night. My hands are covered in calluses." He held them up, showing me palms that were rough and cracked. "But it's honest work, and for the first time in my life, I'm not ashamed of what I'm doing." I listened, my face neutral, giving him nothing. He continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I've been thinking a lot this past year. About you. About everything you did for me. I used to think you owed me something because you're my mother. I thought that's how it worked. That you were supposed to take care of me no matter what. But I was wrong, Mama." So wrong. His eyes filled with tears, and he wiped them away quickly, embarrassed. "You didn't owe me anything. You gave me everything, and I took it all and threw it away. I blamed you for my failures. I called you selfish when you were the least selfish person I've ever known." I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness yet, but something softer. A crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. "I'm not here to ask for money," he said, his voice stronger now. "I'm here to ask for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back, but I needed you to know that I see it now. I see what I did, and I'm trying to be better." I walked past him into the kitchen. He stood there, uncertain, probably thinking I was going to tell him to leave, but I reached into the cabinet and pulled out 2 mugs. I poured coffee into both, the steam rising between us like a bridge being built. "Sit down, Calvin," I said quietly. He sat on the couch, hands folded in his lap, watching me with cautious hope. I handed him a cup and sat across from him in my recliner. We drank in silence for a moment, the weight of the past year settling around us like dust. "Tell me about your job," I said. He looked surprised, like he expected judgment instead of curiosity. "It's tough. I start at 5 in the morning. We load shipments, organize the warehouse, sometimes work 12-hour shifts. The pay isn't great, but it's steady. I'm learning things. Responsibility. Time management. How to work with people who depend on me." I nodded slowly. "And you like it?" He hesitated, then smiled slightly. "I don't love it, but I respect it. And I respect myself more because of it." That answer meant more to me than any apology ever could, because it showed me that Calvin was finally growing up. Not because I forced him, but because life had. "Mama," he said, setting his cup down, "I don't expect you to forget what I did. I don't expect things to go back to how they were. But I wanted you to know that cutting me off was the best thing you ever did for me. It hurt. God, it hurt so much. But it woke me up." I looked at him. This man who used to be my baby boy, and I felt my walls crack a little more. "I forgive you, Calvin," I said softly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means I'm not going to carry the weight of your mistakes anymore. You have to carry them yourself now." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. I understand. We talked for another hour. He told me about his apartment, small and bare, but his own. He told me about his co-workers, about the life he was slowly building. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't make excuses. He just shared his truth. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. Thank you, Mama, for everything. Even for saying no. I watched him walk to his car, a beat-up sedan he'd probably bought with his own money. I watched him drive away, and this time, I didn't feel heartbreak. I felt pride. I went back inside and sat in my recliner. I turned off the TV and let the silence fill the room. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of peace. Hard-earned, well-deserved peace. I thought about everything I'd been through. The years of sacrifice, the betrayal, the heartbreak. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace, who gave until there was nothing left. And I thought about the woman I'd become, strong, dignified, unshakable. Respect doesn't come from being loud. It doesn't come from demanding attention or forcing people to see your worth. It comes from being sure of yourself, from knowing what you deserve, and refusing to settle for less. From understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away. To anyone listening to this story tonight, I want you to hear this. If you've spent your life giving until it hurt, if your own family has tried to guilt you into surrendering your peace, if you've been called selfish for choosing yourself, stand your ground. You don't owe anyone your happiness. You don't owe anyone your security. You don't owe anyone the rewards you earned through your own blood, sweat, and tears. I spent decades being used, decades being dismissed, decades believing that love meant sacrifice without boundaries. But I learned something powerful in my 65th year. Love without respect isn't love. It's exploitation. And the people who truly care about you will never ask you to destroy yourself to prove your loyalty. You've earned your rest. You've earned your peace. You've earned the right to say no without explanation or apology. And if anyone tries to take that from you, show them the door. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't screaming or fighting or proving your point. Sometimes the best revenge is peace. Quiet, dignified, unshakable peace. And if they ever come back, changed and humbled, you'll know it's real. Because real change doesn't demand anything. It just shows up, acknowledges the damage, and asks quietly if healing is possible. I'm 66 now. I sit in my recliner most evenings, feet up, heart light. I don't have much. But what I have is mine. And no one will ever take it from me again. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more stories of quiet justice. Hit that notification bell, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is peace.